special talk by our dear colleague, Dr. Philip Aghoghovwia. It's a bittersweet affair because we always look forward to Philip's papers with eagerness. But today we'll be hearing his paper with a little bit of sadness too. It's his last paper that he'll deliver here as a member of staff in the Department of English. He's heading to greener pastures in Canada. So we wish him all the best, and I wanted to start on that personal note. But I'm sure we'll have you back, Philip, for many more engagements and papers. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Philip Aghoghovwia, who is a senior lecturer here in the Department of English. He has been a fellow and awardee of several prestigious organizations, including the AHP, the Carnegie Corporation of New York and African Studies Association. He was a 2021 fellow, the DHET Future Professors Program, the UFS Future Generation Professoriate, and then his research focuses on environmental humanities, African literature, energy and water studies, and the culture and politics of resource extraction in Africa. And it's very exciting to announce, if you haven't heard the fantastic news, that Philip's book, Ecotropes, Petroculture in the Niger Delta, will be published this month by the HSRC Press. So we're very much looking forward to that. And now I hand over to Philip to tell us about post-colonial nature. Thank you, Philip.
Thank you, Rick. Hi, everyone, and welcome to this talk. I hope I'm able to do justice to your time. Just to add to what Rick has said, this is also new for me because over the last 2 years, I have hosted this speaker series, and so it feels interesting and almost disconcerting to be on the other side rather than hosting this series. I am sitting on the hot seat, so yes, so it's a bit strange, but this is not a valedictory talk, by no means not, because I see myself as one who's been quite privileged to work with dear colleagues in this department, and I hope that will not change, and I'll be more than happy whenever I'm called upon to give a talk, to share my research with the department in the coming months and years. So this talk today forms part of my recent work that attends to the place of nature, writ large, of course, in the environmental politics, not only of post-colonial Africa, but also in the environmental politics of our time, thinking, of course, from the place of Africa. And a version of this talk will appear in the edited volume titled Nature and Literary Studies under the auspices of Cambridge University Press. So I think that book should come out in the next 2 or 3 months or so. I've been told it will come out in late northern summer. So my talk today will try to think with three nodes, 3 vectors from which to think about post-colonial nature. And just to enlarge the screen, I'm going to turn off my video, and so I can see the slides properly. Okay, thank you.
Philip, are you there? Your mic is on the
Yes,
Okay.
I seem to be struggling. Okay, I'm just going to leave it like this. I hope it's visible enough.
Yes, we
Okay.
can see it clearly.
Okay. Yeah. Oh, better now. Okay. Great. In the ecological thought, Timothy Morton discusses new ways of negotiating assumptions about what might count as ecological consciousness. Surmising that ecological thinking might be quite different from our assumptions about it, if one considers it to exist outside the purview of nature. So for Morton, nature is a rarefied thing of purity, harmony, hierarchy, and mystery, undisturbed by the banality of everyday experience. As a result, for him, these sublime aspects of nature fail to serve ecology well, for ecology exists outside the implicit definitions of nature and embraces the interconnectedness of the life world within which are embedded the non-human environment and humanity. Thus, Martin advocates for a conception of ecology without nature, because ecology is profoundly about coexistence, which includes human and non-human species. So Martin's reflection pushes against dominant conceptions of nature and ecological consciousness, which often see nature as a significant marker of value. So according to Martin, ecological thoughts is a practice and a process of becoming fully aware of how human beings are connected with other beings. He lists them: animal, vegetable, minerals. If ecological thought is conceived as a practice and as a process, it suggests then that its principles of interpretation are not static, but in constant flux, changing with the circumstances under which the coexistence, which he talks about, of all beings is imagined and performed. But it is important to state quite clearly here that Morton's book is not a postcolonial text. And as I will show later during the course of this talk, I do not necessarily agree with his outright banishment of nature, even if in the context of his book, in a metaphysical sense, from the realm of everyday experience and meaning. Nevertheless, the text resonates compellingly with postcolonial theory in its distillations of ecology and the mutuality of being as the ethical and philosophical conditions under which nature or its fraught colonial conception might find rehabilitation, especially in the postcolonial life world, as I will presently show. But I'm sure we all agree that indeed, when you check the Oxford English Dictionary, you realize that nature has no set definition, except in a general sense, it actually denotes all things, essence, material, immaterial, which are created outside of human agency and intention, including, of course, humans ourselves. However, this is not the case with the nature that the term postcolonial qualifies. It is a concept created by human intention. Postcolonial nature, putting nature in scare quotes, comes dripping with historicity. In fact, the phrase postcolonial nature is a bit oxymoronic, an odd collocation to think about in the context of environmentalism in the postcolonial. This is because nature comes to the colonized world marked with the insignia of colonialism and imperialism, a combination that leaves the previously colonized subject and their senses of being with and within nature perpetually open to exploitation and trauma. In fact, nature is not a concept that describes human and non-human relations in the post-colony such as Africa, nor does it frame the life world which living species inhabit and the inanimate species that surround quotidian existence. Rather, nature is a colonial import that commodifies all these objects, entities, beings, and concepts into tangible values that are, in fact, contrary to the manner of their actual existence in their natural or primordial habitat. So in this talk, I'm going to reflect on three vectors that inscribe this historicity I'm describing now of postcolonial nature as the articulation of a certain lived experience. The first, as I've mentioned in my blurb, is land grabbing that renders indigenous inhabitants automatic serfs within their own environment. Arrogant forms of conservation that expel human populations from their ancestral land. And the third, destructive extractions of natural resources motivated by seductive but abstract metrics of economic growth that cannot be measured in terms of ecological or any kind of well-being of the particular local life world. So engaging directly with nature in post-colonial thought is not possible, for it must confront the imperatives of nature's colonial and imperialist history. A necessary circumlocution, as you will see, that enables us to approach nature as a powerful signifier of being and quotidian experience in the post-colonial context. But just a little bit of digression to situate my work within post-colonial theory, precisely post-colonial eco-criticism. The field of post-colonial eco-criticism has been slow to develop, precisely because eco-criticism and post-colonial studies have often run the risk of talking past rather than talking to each other. For instance, the initial discourse of ecologism, deep ecology, was framed around an oppositely scathing critique of anthropocentrism. But these anthropos, from which anthropocentrism is derived, or human, whose peculiar history on the earth poses so much of a threat, deserves criticism, and deserves criticism, of course, does not really name and describe all humans, as some scholars, including myself elsewhere, have noted, precisely because that label has not always meant a unified constituency of human beings. Nevertheless, the important studies done by post-colonial scholars, such as you see on the screen now, and many more, these are just a few whose work I have drawn on in the course of this paper. Especially in the last decade or so, conceive of the human in nature, generatively in eco-criticism. In the process, these scholars bring both disciplines into conversation and foreground areas of important convergences. The strong version of these critics' arguments, I hope I'm not doing injustice to the important individual arguments that they make, but the strong version of the argument is that both disciplines, that is, post-colonial studies and eco-criticism, are mutually coextensive and thus unified in their critique against human hubris, evident mostly in imperialism and anthropocentric modernity, two of the most impactful vectors that index human activity and its footprint on the earth. More specifically, Euro-American imperialism and its attendant capitalist modernity have exacted much violence on the environment and peoples of the colonized world, including of their own societies, whose resources have fed the engines of contemporary consumer capitalism. The form of globalism that this combination unleashes registers the impulse to extract from the people and environment deemed inferior or inconsequential to the ontological constitution of imperialism, read in this context as Euro-American, as the universalizing and therefore normative condition of being. Thus, postcolonial eco-criticism in Africa, precisely, but more generally in the postcolonial world, is a critique of the combination of modernization, globalization, and capitalism, including, let's not deceive ourselves, the collusion of some crass African leadership that have opened African peoples and environments to rampant exploitation and trauma. And the case of the Wild Coast is all too fresh for us, even though the communities might have experienced a victory in the court of law, but let's not relax, because capitalism and its hunger for natural resource is a very strong motivation, which would force these corporations to go back and find new ways of returning to the Wild Coast to prospect for natural gas. So the scholars whose works I have drawn on in this talk offer ways. I'm happy to mention some of them in the Q&A, but suffice it to say, they offer ways of understanding nature as a concept steeped in post-colonialism and environmental concerns, interlinking the agency of the oppressed with the fates of the exploited environment in Africa. So I want now to turn to three specific vectors that inscribe this post-colonial nature as the articulation of a certain kind of lived experience. I will then conclude with a brief reflection using the trope of water in the South African context to explore how nature in the post-colonial context can be reconceptualized and in the process possibly readmitted from Martin's banishment. In what she calls the nature industry, echoing Adorno and Horkheimer's 1940s treatise on America, the cultural industry, Louis Green examines how nature in the post-colony is subsumed in the instrumental logic of capitalist production, quote, while at the same time subject to certain hunting, close quote, in the light of global environmental crisis. Post-colonial nature thus inhabits an aporia, its peculiarly complex history becoming its commodification, quote, its precise value as an object of commerce being its precarious evanescence, close quote. Land grabbing is one such practice that indexes the nature industry, Pace Green in Africa. Land grabbing in Africa is, of course, as old as the colonial encounter on the continent, dating back to the 17th century when the earliest European seafarers landed on the shores of the African coast. But for the purpose of this lecture, I want to focus on recent trends as they relate to the commodification of nature in the light of globalization's overreach for endless economic growth, profligate consumption, and the environmental crisis that follows in the wake. Land grabbing is, of course, an informal pejorative term used to name and describe the accelerated processes of large-scale acquisition of productive agricultural land by private corporations and other foreign entities to secure arable land for biofuel production and growing food, often monocrops, commercially for export to richer consumers elsewhere. But these practices have adversely affected the food sovereignty of Africa. I'm just going to place on the screen a set of mind-boggling statistics on land acquisitions in Africa by multinational corporations, according to a recent edition of The Voice magazine. So I'm just going to leave it there and skip that part. So Africa is here presented as the quintessential frontier of this rush. In the calculus of this exchange with the agents of globalization and big money and big money. The incentive is to venture into large-scale farming in order to sustain lifestyles that are dependent on massive consumption of electricity and the demand for fresh produce in all seasons. Often, this venture does not contribute to easing the economic pressures Africa continues to face, but rather uses African fertile land as the background for the expansion of global capital for the world's wealthy and for the sustenance of their excessive consumption. The continent accounts for about 60% of the world's remaining arable land. Yet the basis for Africa's livelihood is smallholder farming, which is increasingly being squeezed out of the fray. As is well documented in several studies, colonial land grabbing in the previous centuries compelled Africans into forced and sometimes enslaved labor on their ancestral land, and South Africa is a case in point, at the hands of their European colonizers. But the recent land grab by big corporations and aggressive foreign government is creating a new wave of servitude as well as of temporary workers. And as a result, the continent, which where agriculture remains the key sector that holds the potential, even though it's not quite clear as yet, but one that holds the potential of achieving sustainable, inclusive growth for Africa. This is definitely something to be worried about, because what is peculiar about the phenomenon of land grabbing is that this new gold rush is driven largely by external entities whose motive is to grow agricultural products and export the harvest to the countries where the investment originates or to richer foreign markets overseas for maximum profit. So even when domestic interests are involved, it is often in the form of collusion or some kind of minor partnership that renders them as mere compradors. The recent wave of land grabbing has been around for more than a decade now. Moreover, one wonders why literary imagining is yet to notice it, even when there is a strong evidence of a link between the effects of land grabbing and the economic factors that force young people to migrate to Europe in search of, well, as Rick mentioned, greener pastures, guilty as charged. The body of writing on African migration is rich, of course, especially literature on the trans-Mediterranean migration of African youth to Europe, of which Helen Habila's fourth novel, Travelers, is a recent addition. The focus of this novel is the recent tragedy of African migrants and refugees in Europe. While the author pays sensitive attention to the struggles of each of the characters whose individual stories form an important arc of an important strand, of the six-part narrative. The novel, however, neglects to trace back to Africa, for instance, some of the possible conditions that might have forced these travelers out of Africa, one of which one might imagine or speculate would be the loss of land or hunger resulting from the failed harvest due to unavailable arable land. In a sense, the adverse effects of land grabbing have yet to capture the imagination of African writers. That's what I'm trying to argue here. But of course, the issue is more complicated than I'm suggesting here. Not to preempt any pushback from the audience. But I take it that corporations buying land appears to be business as usual for capitalism. At any rate, the United States, for instance, has more individual private mega landowners than anywhere else. Moreover, growing plants for biofuel and crops does not really appear to overtly be damaging the environment. These practices do not evince spectacular violence, as someone like Rob Nixon would put it. And even the impact on the poor individual might be indirect. It is not often accounted for initially when these corporations take over community land and employ farmers to work for them. But this indirectness forms part of the crux of the matter. That is the indirectness of the effects on the individual post-colonial subject. Indeed, it is one of those cases where the costs of progress, at least as it initially features or appears to be when these corporations approach these communities to buy their land or rent their land. Yeah, in terms of the business, are often hidden. The cost of that progress are often hidden or displaced by the more visible phenomenon, many times removed from what causes it. Perhaps this explains why it is hard to represent in African literary writing. And of course, the argument I'm making here echoes in some ways to Amitav Ghosh's The Great Derangement, especially the very first chapter of that book, because he makes a parallel argument with the difficulties of representing climate change in narrative fiction. He says that because the causes of climate change are too numerous and too far removed from the effects, they become too improbable to justify in narrative engagement. So there's a similar argument being made here, which is why reading the fiction of one like Helen Abila about the tragedy of migration, one would be hard pressed to find the connection between what pushes these youth across that treacherous body of water and what must have prompted that in the first instance. So the second vector through which to think about post-colonial nature is conservation. It is not that not that conservation is inherently bad, but the manner of its practice historically and constitutively in the landscapes inhabited by the previously colonized has profoundly undermined the interests and even threatened the very existence of the local populations. Africa, for instance, often gets feted for its natural landscape, conceived as a vast plain of rich and diverse plants and wildlife. However, this facticity often articulates in a conservationist register, mostly by specialist conservationists who are often Western, in a manner that presents the local human presence and cultures there as nuisances, even when they inextricably interlink with the natural environment. In his essay on the Indian context, titled The Authoritarian Biologists and the Arrogance of Anti-Humanism, the Indian historian Ramakantra Guha discusses how wildlife conservation and the propagandistic rhetoric with which nature preservation practices are justified tend to privilege wildlife and other protected species over the human population in such natural habitats. Guha provides instances of how the practices and arguments by conservationists and park administrators have created a dangerous antagonism between poor tribal people who have lived in the areas for generations against those of wilderness lovers and urban pleasure seekers who wish to keep parks free of human interference, that is, free of other humans. In pointing out the prejudices that define wildlife conservation in these zones, Guha argues that biologists, international agencies, and government functionaries who believe in wilderness and species preservation for the sake of science tend to be unified and in their hostility to the human population who inhabit these landscapes of wild parks and sanctuaries. He notes that these conservationists consistently embark on campaigns that cast local communities in these locations, quote, as having a destructive effect on the environment, their forms of livelihood, aiding the disappearance of species and contributing to soil erosion, habitat simplification, and worse, close quotes. So he cautions against the strong pejorative language used by conservationists and biologists when describing human practices in these demarcated wild reserves. For him, this rhetoric has further informed, quote, numerous projects across the world to constitute nature parks by throwing out the human inhabitants of these areas with scant regard for their past or future in the name of the global heritage of biological diversity, close quote. So Guha says that scientific and aesthetic interests in other species, however, sometimes blind them to the legitimate interests of the less fortunate members of their own, that is, the local inhabitants. Conservation, because of the mold and consequences of these practices, become therefore a vestige of colonialism, constituting the present stage of what I call the Seas Project that make up the colonizing mission of imperial expedition. The others, as Raymond Bonner suggests, are Christianity, commerce, and civilizing. So using the term green missionaries, Guha declares conservation biologists possibly more dangerous and certainly more hypocritical than their economic and religious counterparts, and notes that conservationists tend to be less tolerant of the less fortunate who do not accept the salvaging project of nature preservation. Hence, they want, for instance, to protect the tiger or whale for posterity, yet expect other people who must live with the direct consequences to make the sacrifices of being dispossessed and dislocated, and of having to relocate to other less arable and less inhabitable places. In comparing the consequence of this form of colonial nature conservation and practices on local landscape to other less dangerous colonial incursions, Guha says, the process unleashed by the green imperialism are well nigh irreversible. The consumer, titillated into trying out Kentucky Fried Chicken, can always say, once is enough, while the Hindu converted by baptism to Christianity can decide later to revert to his or her original faith. But tribal people, thrown out of their homes by the propaganda of the conservationists, are condemned to the life of an ecological refugee, a fate for many forest people, which is next only to death. So in what in what elsewhere he calls a distinctively North Atlantic anti-human full stomach environmentalism, Guha concludes that scientists and conservationists who operate in protected areas in the countries of the South must take full cognizance of the rights of the people who have lived in and oftentimes cared for the landscape long before it became a national park or a World Heritage Site. So this palpable anti-human tendency evident in the practices of conservationists and scientists thus provokes and shapes the politically charged topos of nature and ecology in post-colonial African imaginaries. Take, for instance, the documentary film Elephant People by the Zimbabwean writer Tsitsi Dangaremba. An interesting text that bears out some of the conservation dilemmas Guha enumerates. The film project was commissioned by the Ford Foundation in collaboration with the National Park Commission of Zimbabwe in order to document the reality of elephant conservation and the challenges and prospects it presents for the local economy and daily life of the local inhabitants. In the opening sequences of the film, we see an obviously impoverished and distraught family mourning the passing of their 13-year-old child, a cattle herder who had been killed by an elephant in their locality. Two interlocutors voice similar accounts of this misfortune that merits reflecting upon here. There is the Caucasian conservationist, evidently sympathetic to the grieving family, of course, who describes in gruesome detail the manner of the lad's death by the elephant. According to him, the elephant is said to have pinned the boy to the ground, pierced his body with her tusk, and remained on the lifeless body for hours to the excruciating terror of the community. The other respondents, ostensibly related to the grieving family or just a member of the local community, relates a more intimate account. The quotes you find on the screen now. It says, Proud Chauvelin, the name of the victim, was killed while on an honest errand for his father, looking after his father's cattle. The devil is working against us. For 3 months, elephants were reported coming to the village. They come from the Gonarezhou National Park, but no action was taken until this boy was killed. So what I want to draw your attention to in this narrator's positioning is the fact that he has not put the blame on the park authorities, nor has he particularly blamed the obviously offending elephant. Rather, he considers the lad's death and the fate of his community the machinations of the devil. So this is one instance in which, stripped of agency, the victims of conservation have nowhere to turn for succor or actual recompense for their loss, whether legally or even morally. Nor are they able to remove themselves from the terrible situation in which they are now trapped. The third node from which I reflect on postcolonial nature is resource extraction. So what constitutes environmental concerns in the context of Africa and elsewhere in the postcolonial world, as Guha shows, is indeed of global concern, for it is the unrestrained reach of global capital and its forces into the far corners of the planet, transforming rural communities into fields of resource extraction without accounting for the disruptions inflicted. In the economic calculus of resource extraction, what is considered to be of economic benefit is often at odds with the kind of value that local communities place on their habitats. In his book, To Cook a Continent, Destructive Extraction and Climate Crisis in Africa, the Nigerian writer and activist Nimo Bassey provides a scathing critique of how the extraction of raw materials from Africa continues to impoverish the continent while swelling the coffers of the metropolitan West, who are often behind these investments. Bassey shows how the climate crisis in Africa is not just about the environment, but about the imperiled economy, the combination of which has dealt a devastating blow to the very fabric of African societies, including government's inability to introduce fiscal policies around natural resources that stimulate inclusive growth, especially for the contiguous communities. The consequences are widespread poverty and youth unemployment that ensue amidst high economic activities in the extraction industry. So Bassi notes, for instance, how the, I quote, extractive sector in Africa has succeeded in making itself seen as the answer to the economic travails of the continent. However, this has never charted a clear path towards development or prosperity. It has rather proven counterproductive because local communities in proximity to the particular natural resource are often presented with the dubious choice between ephemeral jobs and ecological well-being. According to Bassi, in a given community, nature has an intrinsic value based on certain ethical values and practices, which, I quote, can never be reduced to the functionality, close quote, of neoliberal economics. This mode of reasoning is, of course, not peculiar to Nimo Bassi. Critiques against extractive capitalism often articulate from the position of ecological and cultural grounding, providing a form of environmental consciousness that is shot through with the material textures of the lived realities of local cultural life. But what I want to draw attention to here is what he does with this idea beyond his polemic writing, using poetry in this instance. So despite the very clear moral insight that Bassi demonstrates in identifying quite clearly the challenges of resources extraction in local landscapes and economics, the writer appears to be measured in his articulation of resistance and ultimately of justice. For him, the task of rebuilding from the rubble of capitalist exaction from local ecologies lies with the collective. For in the process, we not only protect the natural environment, but also the economy it sustains. So take his poem titled Polluted Throats, published elsewhere, not in the book I quoted earlier. There is an unusual collocation at play here. Pollution associated with the contamination of mostly an environment and a natural environment, and throat, a word which is metonymic of human needs and of human parts, but often associated with eating and drinking, a gesture to economy. So both items are in juxtaposition here to point to the twinned interests of ecology and economics at the heart of Bassi's vision. So he intimates in this poem, at the yellow fields of Jacinto, Zambrano drinks polluted streams, sees his rice field die, stands back and waits. He wails, it may kill us, but what can we do? The question that won't run away, but what can we do? Something. That's what we can do and must. So here, the poet is seen to, the poet persona is seen to employ a farmer figure, Zambrano, to stand in for those whose means of existence alongside the local environment is doubly decimated by the effects of resource extraction. The poem expresses how urgent and decisive action can infuse ecological awareness with productive agency and inspire courage, even in a dispiriting situation where oppressed people throw up their hands in a defeatist relinquishment. Hence, in response to Zambrano's hopeless declaration, it may kill us, but what we do, the poet persona inspires hope in the following stanza. Something. That's what we can do and must. So here, the poet is suggesting that even when the odds are overwhelmingly against the oppressed, collective action can be a counterpoint to the powerful ambivalence of capitalism's business as usual stance, in order to challenge the double decimation inflicted on local existence in the throes of of resource extraction. I would have loved to say more, to pause briefly to reflect on the reticence or even modesty intimated in the last stanza, because it is quite obvious there and should not be ignored. Because in many ways, I think this reticence equally works powerfully to involve the reader, to implicate the collective to act. And it is also complicated by the ambiguity of the metaphor something, a very fascinating reference through which the poet infuses his poem with some kind of political affect as a way of interlinking ecology and economics, or rather, grounding his postcolonial environmentalism in the link between ecology and economics. But I think sometimes the profundity of a poem is protected when one does not say too much. So I'll just leave it there and let you reflect on it on your own. Postcolonial nature, as I have shown throughout this talk so far, is seen to be shot through with the historicity of colonial imperialism that constitutes that continues into the present. However, a genuine eco-critic would push back and say there's a sense of sublimating human suffering onto the place of nature. And my response would be, this is not necessarily the case, because literary depictions tend to trope on figurations of animism, therefore reinforcing the agency of nature, and also evoking agential nature in a way that puts in check the anthropocentric impulses that might inhabit the agency of the oppressed in their attempt to resist these kinds of exactions on local life. So in this way, by evoking agential nature, it does appear, that's what I'm trying to argue here, that the non-human interests are taken into account. And I shall presently substantiate that with the short text I'm going to reflect on. But indeed, animism provides a powerful platform for action to advance ecological justice for local communities that otherwise lack the instruments of science, legality, and sophisticated public relations to promote and validate their cause. And thanks to the important work done by the likes of Harry Garuba, animism has recently become the site of serious intellectual inquiry into legitimate and respectable, quote, way of knowing and acting in the world. Garuba acknowledges the work of environmental movements in the global south, whose ethical and political positions lean towards animistic understandings of indigenous communities and their insistence on the agency of the environment and other non-human entities as the basic conditions of quotidian existence and of meaning making. He takes as his point of departure a critique of the colonial logic that suggests animist understandings of the natural and social world as functioning as an aberration. I quote here, the past in the present to be disciplined so as to create civilized world and subjects, close quote. But the recent events of modern implosions such as global warming, resource depletion, and other cataclysmic climate events across the planet show that the human civilization premised on colonial modernity has reached its end. Hence, the return to otherworldly ways beyond the limits of enlightenment that animism allows to thrive in order to achieve true meaning and ecological well-being for all entities, living and non-living. And one of the natural resources whose depiction exemplifies the manner in which animism tropes as indexical of postcolonial nature is water. Indeed, water is increasingly gaining importance in thinking about the ways in which literature scripts ecological shifts and therefore ontological shifts in the wake of climate change. And what you see on your screen are just a few texts in South African literature that in the last several years engage water as a way of reflecting on ecological and ontological conditions of being under the cloud of climate change. And also the recent special issue to which I contributed, of course, on reading for water in Africa is also evidence to this traction that reflecting on water has enjoyed in recent times. And in South Africa, the crisis of water acutely indexes the anthropogenic climate crisis. In fact, water is such a big issue in this country that it is one of the recurring tropes similar to racism or settler colonialism in South African literary imagining. Figurations of water in South African literature feature in certain prevailing religious and spiritual convictions, as I have reflected on elsewhere in one of my previous publications on this topic. And often there is the investment of special powers in the character, mostly religious, as in the prophetess in Jabulon, this short story on the screen there, or exoteric and hermetic, as in Mother in Karen J's novel, whose relation to water drives the plot in whole or in part, bridging the gap between material and symbolic significations of water. There's also the imbuing of the particular natural scape where the water is located with a hallowed ambience, a sacredness that inspires often either a mythical mode of cognition or a particular interiority that presents the human character as respectful of this natural scape. So in this way, literary depictions are seen to construct narratives using water as motif around a character, a protagonist, or an idea, or even a problem. But often the character is seen to return and to show certain cultural significance of the space contiguous to this natural resource, such as water. And to this end, I have returned once again to a short story which continues to be generative for me, not only in my scholarship but also in my teaching. Etienne van Heerden's Poison Karoo, a short story which was published in 2012, and it exemplifies this trope I'm trying to this topos I'm describing now. The story registers the writer's protest against South African government's proposal to frack for natural gas in the Karoo region in the rural country of central South Africa. So the author here has employed the genre of the short story in preference to the novel, which is arguably his main preoccupation, which has a longer gestation period, ostensibly as a means of conveying his own timely intervention in the then prevailing debate on fracking. Van Heerden has also deployed a short story to explore the delicate and often fragmentary domain of culture, which is not often accounted for in the logics of economic metrics that accompany proposals of fossil fuel extraction. And the main character we see is a moral and on the surface eccentric character, Ludo Lolorea, who considers the possible threat posed to the groundwater upon which the arid communities depend as an affront to the very soul of that landscape. He reads of hydrofracking and how poison water is pumped deep into the layers of rock, and how it breaks and fractures the rocks and drives gas upwards to the surface, to industry, to the people. And he thinks, I must do something about this with my last ounce of strength. So upon arriving in Cape Town, where the national protest is taking place, Ludo is shocked by what he finds: the sense of gaiety in the air and the slogans that carry the protest message. Stop fracking now, leave our fracking Karoo alone, frack off. For Ludo, these slogans are unacceptable, for they do not account for the seriousness of the threat underground water upon which life in the Karoo depends. For Ludo, the kind of atmosphere. So for him, this atmosphere of carnival does not accommodate the sacredness of water in the arid landscape, and therefore makes light of the actual significance of what is afoot. So he walked right at the back of the parade in the slipstream of sweat and noisy chattering, and knew he would never feel at one with the protesters. There was something in him which always stood to one side, observing everything, wondering against what ghosts or masters in their own minds, people fighting this or that cause, were actually protesting. It was these thoughts and his uneasiness at activism's narrow boundaries that made him decide to drive to the Karoo alone in silence. He would go and see for himself, and he would make his own quiet protest. So he walks away from this exterior performance that he sees as one ostensibly staged to protest fracking. Instead, he opts for a more measured protest marked by solitude, by silence, by interiority, to the fountainhead in the Karoo, where his father once oversaw water distribution in his community. So this preference for interiority over the exterior performativity of the gathering signals a sacred regard for water and its agency as the primary condition of cultural life in that particular habitat. So what we see in this story, therefore, is a character going back not to nature as a material realm, but to a specific place with history, a history of common heritage marked by the shared usage of water and mutual coexistence that Martin talks about, and as I have discussed in the opening part of this talk. However, what Van Heerden's text indicates is not the erasure of agential nature, its banishment from the site of mutual coexistence and cultural meaning. Rather than banishment, nature is seen here to be reconceptualized materially and symbolically within the cultural and historical matrices of its particular existence. The word Karoo means first, I'm preaching to the choir here, a place known for its aridity. So water therefore signifies in this text as both a material condition of life in that landscape and as a sacred symbol of life's mystery and depth, the depth which is lacking in the sites of the protests that he observes. And since the water the available water in the Karoo is subterranean, whose gamuts cannot be fully captured by the logic of human meaning and human performativity, accounts for why he removes himself from that space in order to preserve that possible mystery, but also one shot through with material relevance to his community as a space of mutual coexistence. So that's where I'll pause for now. Often I don't like any kind of conclusion because it suggests conclusive thought or argument in one's presentation. But this is a gesture of rehabilitating nature as I see it in these kinds of writing about water. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Philip. That was a very rich, but also a very urgent paper, I think, and I think everyone will agree. We're constantly aware, not only of the precarity of our future natures, but also how we're implicated in its disappearance. And I think I'd like to ask you. I suppose I'll get the ball rolling by asking you perhaps a fairly cynical question. I wonder, with the rise of climate fiction to represent many different ways the trouble facing environment, the natural environment around the world, and the built environment for that matter, whether on the one hand there isn't too great an onus placed on the novel as a medium for moral or ethical instruction. That's part of the question. And on the other hand, whether one might not read the rise in climate fiction not only as a response to feelings of impending doom, but as a response to sort of market conditions which allow us to take a stake in climate fiction because we have a stake in the future of nature, of course, but whether this this market determined rise in climate fiction and our reading of it doesn't perhaps lead to a certain passivity, whether climate fiction actually engenders any kind of activism, or whether there's a sort of paralyzing cathartic effect in whether we feel somehow virtuous for reading climate fiction and then to quote to abuse the poem that you quoted, to not do something. Sorry, that was very entangled, but sort of two parts to that question.
Entangled, but also quite articulate. I think the answer is already embedded in your question. But I will just add that indeed, because what you're saying now is similar to the argument that Ghosh makes quite brilliantly in that book, The Age of Derangement, that not necessarily because climate fiction has been banished, for instance, I'm sure it's clear to you, has been banished to the realm of speculative fiction, because some of the most profound writings on the planet in peril are found in speculative fiction, which I can't really do justice to because it's an area I have not really educated myself on. But I think in the literary practice of Africa, I'm generalizing here, and it's also evident in the works I have assembled for this talk today. In the literary practice, at least quite recently, you will see that a lot of people are moving away from climate fiction, from fiction as a genre, to other forms of engaging the urgency of the concerns we all face. And like I said, Van Hayden's short story is one such for me. There is also, thanks to Helene, this Koleka Putuma's collection, I'm really enjoying some of the poems I'm reading, and I think they are even more profound, more articulate in the concerns and possible solutions that are being articulated there in the form of the short story. So I'm making a case here for short stories, that short stories are, short stories are one way of moving past the economic over determination of the kind of genres that respond to climate change, such as climate fiction. There's also a poem, which I also demonstrate here, that even activists who are aware of the power of the medium by which they articulate these things, who are equally writers themselves, are also pushing against this need to write fiction, and instead finding other ways. Nemo Bassi is also a performance poet, but he also writes. And instead, they are relying on other mediums as a way of sounding the urgency of their message, and as a way of also reaching out to more people than the few or the select few who read fiction. So the writing practice of Africa is already pushing back against that. That's the short answer to your question. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Questions from the audience? Thank you. Eileen, and then Marisa.
Thank you, Rick. Thank you, Philip. Philip, first, I just want to say how much I always learn from you. I am just so thankful for everything you've taught me, and for every encounter I've had with your work. Your current paper has my head buzzing, so I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to articulate a coherent question, but I am interested in your reading of that short story of Poison Karoo and Poison Water, and the place of the sacred, and this concept of rehabilitating nature. Your reading of post-colonial nature, I think, is so beautifully attentive to the mess that we are in, and the near impossibility of undoing this mess, certainly within our current sort of capitalist structures. But I'm weirdly or fortuitously, I'm busy reading the work of Michelle Murphy. I don't know if I've told you about her. Maybe you know about her work. She's a Métis scholar in Canada who works on chemical violence. And she's developed this notion of alter life, to think about the way in which we live in these chemical entanglements with the many chemicals that exist in our environment that are destructive of our health and of the health of non-human natures, but that we cannot not be entangled with. So it's sort of a permanent interdependence. You know, I mean, you can think of those forever chemicals, for instance, that's now everywhere in our water, in the air that we breathe, you know, outside of those chemical relations. And she's trying to think through this notion of alter life as acknowledging those relations and finding ways of understanding, I don't know if it's sort of rehabilitative possibilities with that knowledge of our messy present, but certainly an acknowledgement that we cannot address this present without, at the very least, acknowledging that sort of interdependencies. Anyways, I don't know if there's a question in there, but I was wondering sort of how does one think the notion of rehabilitation, first of all, given the fact that we are in these messy entanglements, and then the question of the sacred, this character who retreats into interiority, solitude, silence, and all of those states are often represented as sort of as isolated, as non-entangled with the mess of the social. But I think the way in which you've read it points it in another direction. So I was wondering if you could just maybe just talk a little bit in a little bit more detail about those connections that you make in that final part of the paper.
Thank you, Helene. It's always what I would call nourishment, conversing with you. Yeah, so I have learned from you as much as you think you have from me. Yeah, so it's mutual, and this is already evidence to that. I'm not familiar with this Michelle Murphy's work, but yes, I think alter life. Yeah, it contributes to the kind of argument, kind of work emerging lately in response to how we react to, because often what has not been accounted for in the discourse on the environment and on nature is the ontological shifts. We've often focused on ecological shifts, and even the science focuses on ecological shifts. But you will notice that lately a number of works are emerging that engage with these possible shifts, not only of how we live, but even of ourselves, and how we have to find ways to become alive to this fact. Often when things happen to the human only notices when it is obvious, sometimes when it is too late. Even think of madness, for instance. When someone is losing their mind, they don't know they are losing their mind until it becomes very obvious. So it's the same, that the ecological shifts is also bringing about ontological shifts. And I think this work you just brilliantly describes speaks to that, the alter life. That is an invitation for us to begin to bear witness to these alterations happening, not only around us, but within us. And I think that short story gestures to that for far too long, we have responded to threats, to ecological threats, to exactions on natural environment, on landscapes by capitalism in a particular way. But that's one way does not really amount to much. It might amount to attention. It might draw attention to itself, draw attention to the problem, but it does not really generate any solution. Take, for instance, by way of going on a tangent, take, for instance, Donald Trump. Is probably the most protested president in the history of democracy, or at least in the last several decades. And yet, even in the wake of the end of his tenure, he's still the most popular, if only protests can do the work. But we see how his policies and his legacy appear to be living on by people who are preserving it quietly. So I think we might draw a lesson from that, and this is what this particular character appears to be suggesting, that this raucous way of addressing in a very exterior performance, and it's not peculiar to any culture or any race or any location. We humans, once we found our voice, once we found the power of collective protest, have seemed to neglect other powerful ways of addressing threats to our lives, and especially those threats that are inside of us, those threats that have brought about our own ontological shifts, our own ontological transformation. So that's what I think this particular passage is alerting us to. So it's almost an invitation to pause and to really think carefully about not only how to protest, but also ask ourselves, what exactly has this ecological shift done to us? How can we account for that? And you of all people would know, being a yogi, would know the importance of reflection, the importance of meditation. So that's what this character is inviting us to do, to meditate, not only as a way of understanding what is happening around, but also understanding what has happened to us. How has this change affected us? And how do we then respond in a way that is appropriate to the changes, both the ecological one and the ontological one?
Thanks, Philip. Marisa. Marisa, I don't know, you dropped out, it seems. Hunter?
I'm
There's
so
Marisa.
sorry.
Sorry, Marisa, go for it.
I beg your pardon. Philip, thank you for a most enlightening paper. I wanted to ask you a question. I read with great interest Robert Bullard and Beverly Wright's book entitled The Wrong Complexion for Protection. And it goes about how governments respond to threats and disasters. And it sort of echoes this urgent refrain that you also alluded to in your talk: we must do something. So my question to you is, do you think we have time? Is it possible to restore the disparities that we have, to restore the balance between honoring the rights of local population and looking at the urgency of conservation? Thank you.
I think no, it is not too late. Thanks for your question, Marisa. Yeah, it is never too late, because the enormity of the problem, while it may be apparent to us, is never fully accounted for. Not even science. That's why they often deploy what they call modeling in trying to capture the enormity of the problem. So to begin to think of what solution might be appropriate to how we conceive the problem, I think that amounts to some kind of delayed tactics. I think by starting by just making small changes, taking small steps, necessary steps, and it's a good way, it's a good start. So it is never too late to, yeah, to find a solution. And I don't know whether I got your question right. You talked about the urgency of conservation. Unless we insert the human, because we also form part of nature, unless we insert the human in that logic of conservation, I think conservation in any other form where the human, especially the human that exists contiguously to this diverse nature that we like to want to protect, unless we insert that human in there, I think no conservation right now is urgent, unless the human is at the center of that project. I hope that answers your question. Thank you.
Thanks, Philip. Thanks, Marisa. Hunter, you have your hand up.
Hi, Philip. Thanks so much for a very insightful talk. I just have a very brief question. I was very interested in you talking about things like wildlife parks and the conservation there, and how it often led to the vilification and displacement of the indigenous people. So, my question is, how do you think we should go about um, promoting conservation, or perhaps using the wildlife centers that we have in place without vilifying or displacing the indigenous people of the area?
Thank you. It's a question meant for policymakers, but I think if there is anything we can draw from history, I don't mean history as shaped by the colonial encounter, but history that precedes colonialism. These areas we have demarcated as in need of conservation are areas where animals have always existed with people until we gave it that name as a conserved or a demarcated space. So we have to find a way to, one, respect the knowledge that people who inhabit that area have in relation to preserving the animals around them. We also have to humble ourselves and learn from how they have conducted life itself in relation to these animals, in relation to these species, that we are only acknowledging the existence of these animals there, and then suddenly we want to do some kind of demarcation and expel the local people out of it. I don't think, yeah, that measure, that approach has actually become anachronistic, because look for instance at Kenya. There is no amount of funding or of specialized conservation injected into wildlife in Kenya that would succeed without taking into consideration the Maasai people who live with these animals, who live in these spaces. So my short answer to your question would be to humble ourselves and actually seek to learn from people who have lived in proximity to these animals and these species, because they form part of that natural environment, and therefore they must not only be center, or at least a major part of the project, but they must also be seen to participate in it. That is to say, on the one hand, they are part of nature, just as all of us are part of nature. On the other hand, they also possess the knowledge that can actually preserve these environments in a way that is sustainable, because they have lived with these animals for thousands of years before the colonial encounter, and before suddenly science pretends to some kind of knowledge, specialized knowledge that is appropriate to the preservation of this landscape. Yeah.
Thank you, Philip. I don't see any other hands up. You're welcome to put them up. We're almost out of time, but in the absence of further questions, Baba, please.
Thank you, Rick. Babata, who is Kudzai, actually. Thanks, Phil, for Taku is my firstborn son. Thanks, Phil, for the enlightening paper. Just two quick ones. I know that there are one or two students at honors level who are embarking on research projects on which have got an eco-critical slant. Perhaps, when you talk of topology and etymologies and the like, we might lose those kinds of people in the discourse. Could you perhaps just in a sentence or two talk to the literariness of post-colonial nature as you understand it, for the benefit of a junior postgrad. And the second thing I just wanted to comment on was that nature, the definition of nature, our understanding of it differs whether we approach it from the point of Western modernity and or African traditional philosophy, as you rightly pointed out. I'm thinking of texts like The Return of the Water Spirit by Pepetela. It's a story about Luanda and how it's a kind of magical realist text. And I'm also thinking of the text, for example, Zex and Das, the whale caller, and that, the the intermittence between nature and between the natural and the human. Thanks.
Okay. There are a set of there are at least two questions there. The one is to say briefly what postcolonial nature might look like in literary imagination, right?
Yes.
Okay. Part of what I'm suggesting here is that an attempt to think about nature in the postcolonial involves some kind of circumlocution, involves an attempt to think about how nature has been misapprehended and in the process exploited, and that it is not possible. First, I begin by saying, even when you open your dictionary to Oxford, the Oxford English Dictionary, you see that there is no satisfactory definition of nature. But often nature is misapprehended as some kind of space or object that is divorced from the place of everyday existence. That is not true, because we are all part of nature. Such that in literary imagination, all of these things are found in their attempts to think about nature. There is the human there. There is nature is imagined from the place of the everyday, as against some kind of divorce from the place of the everyday. And part of what constitutes that space of everyday are ways in which nature is not only misapprehended, misunderstood, but nature is constituted as an object of value from which material value can be extracted. But in much of postcolonial writing, that is not the case. That nature is often imagined as a place also constituted by human existence, and therefore it's a place that consists of all these, but also there's space for the mysterious, because even in our own everyday life, there is often room for the unknown. And so that's how nature is conceived of. And the one who is seen to be the most eccentric in the context of representations of water that I briefly reflected on in South African literature is often attributed with that kind of custodianship, because nature consists of the unknown, and an eccentric human character is seen to be that through whom the unknown is apprehended, which is why in the case of water in South Africa, most of the characters who stand as the bridge or through whom we come to encounter water in one form or the other, these characters are often seen to possess something more than can be materially accounted for.
Thanks, Philip. I think we're just about out of time now, so it just remains for me to thank you again, Philip, for a fantastic paper, and we can gauge how fantastic it was just by the types of questions we got, and the sense that we get also that people could go on talking about this for a very long time. So thank you very much, Philip, for your paper, and we look forward to welcoming you all in 2 weeks' time for our next seminar. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Yeah, thanks for your sharing, Rick, and talk to you soon.
Okay, well, thanks.
Yeah, thanks,
Bye-bye.
Hunter.